The metal garage door groaned as it rolled down, sealing me into what had become my bedroom for the past 3 months. I pulled the thin blanket closer around my shoulders, listening to the autumn wind whistle through the gaps in the doorframe. Outside, I could hear the warm glow of laughter spilling from the windows of the beautiful Victorian house I had helped renovate with my own hands 25 years ago. My name is Victoria Blackwood, and at 71 years old, I was sleeping on a camping cot in my daughter's garage while she hosted another dinner party in the home where I had raised her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. Much if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me then. Through the small window above my makeshift bed, I could see into the dining room where my daughter Sophia was entertaining her new friends, the wealthy socialites from Willowbrook Heights, who had embraced her after her recent marriage to Marcus Pemberton. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier I had picked out myself, the one Thomas and I had saved months to afford when we first bought this house on Rosewood Lane. Thomas, my late husband, would be rolling in his grave if he could see what had become of his precious daughter, and the woman who had once managed a successful interior design firm, serving clients across 3 counties. But Thomas had been gone for 2 years now. Everything had changed since Sophia married Marcus 6 months ago. I shifted on the uncomfortable cot, my arthritis protesting against the cold October air that seeped through every crack in the garage wall. The space heater Marcus had grudgingly provided barely took the edge off the chill, and I'd already caught one cold this season that had lingered for weeks. Dr. Martinez had warned me about my weakened immune system since the stress-induced health issues began. But what was I supposed to do? According to my daughter, I was lucky to have any accommodations at all. "Mom, it's just temporary," Sophia had said 3 months ago, avoiding my eyes as she explained why I needed to move out of the guest bedroom. "Marcus's business associates are staying with us for an extended period. You understand how important first impressions are in his line of work." Marcus Pemberton, 45 years old, inherited wealth, and a smile that never quite reached his calculating gray eye. He'd swept into Sophia's life 18 months after Thomas died, arriving at exactly the moment when my 38-year-old daughter was most vulnerable. She'd been struggling with grief, feeling lost without her father's guidance, questioning every decision she made about the house, her career, her future, and Marcus had provided all the answers she thought she needed. "Your mother seems quite set in her ways," he'd commented early in their courtship, his tone suggesting this was a character flaw rather than the wisdom that comes with decades of experience. Perhaps she'd be more comfortable in a senior living community where she could socialize with people her own age. But I wasn't ready for a nursing home, despite what Marcus's pointed suggestions implied. I was 71, not 91. I still had my faculties, my independence, and until recently my pride. I'd run Blackwood Interiors for 30 years, building it from a small home-based business into a firm that designed spaces for some of the most prestigious homes in the Tri-County area. I'd raised Sophia to be strong, independent, and compassionate. Clearly, I'd failed on at least one of those counts. The garage door to the house opened with a soft click, and I heard footsteps on the concrete floor. Sophia appeared in the doorway, still wearing the elegant black dress Marcus had bought for her, another sign of how much had changed. The Sophia I'd raised would have chosen her own clothes, would have valued substance over appearance. "Mom, I brought you some leftover salmon from dinner," she said, holding a plate covered with foil. Her voice carried the careful tone she used now, polite but distant, as if I were a charity case rather than the woman who had sacrificed everything to give her the best life possible. "Thank you," I replied, accepting the plate though my appetite had disappeared months ago. "How was your party?" "Lovely." Marcus's colleagues were very impressed with the house. She paused, then added with less conviction, "They asked about you. I told them you preferred your privacy." "Your privacy?" As if sleeping in a garage was a lifestyle choice rather than a systematic campaign to make me invisible. Marcus had been clever about it, never directly demanding my removal, but creating situations that made my presence inconvenient. Important dinner parties where my presence might confuse the dynamics, Business meetings in the living room where I might overhear confidential information. Weekend guests who needed the guest room where I'd been staying. Each displacement had been temporary, he assured Sophia. Each had lasted longer than the last. Sophia, I said carefully, we need to talk about this arrangement. It's been 3 months, and winter is coming. This garage isn't insulated for year-round living. Her jaw tightened, and I recognized the defensive posture she'd adopted whenever conversations turned to my living situation. Marcus is looking into converting part of the basement into a proper space for you. It just takes time to get permits and contractors. Marcus was doing no such thing, and we both knew it. He was waiting for me to break, to suggest on my own that perhaps I should look into assisted living, that perhaps I was becoming too much of a burden. He wanted to be the supportive son-in-law who reluctantly agreed to help find me appropriate accommodations, rather than the man who had systematically driven me from my own home. What Marcus didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I had options he couldn't imagine. Hidden in my jewelry box, beneath the false bottom Thomas had installed years ago, were deeds to 3 properties that I'd purchased quietly over the past 15 years. Not one person, not even Thomas, had known about my secret real estate investment. Money I'd carefully diverted from Blackwood Interior's most profitable years, properties I'd bought under a business entity I'd created, independently. One was a charming cottage on Maple Lake, about an hour north of here. Another was a duplex in the historic district of Millbrook that generated steady rental income. The third was a small commercial building downtown that housed a successful cafe and bookstore. Together they were worth well over $2 million, but I wasn't ready to reveal that hand yet. Not until I understood exactly what game Marcus was playing, and how far he was willing to push. Because this wasn't just about me sleeping in a garage. This was about power, control, and the systematic erasure of my place in my daughter's life. Outside, the dinner party continued, the sound of expensive laughter drifting through the night air. I lay back on my cot, pulling the inadequate blanket up to my chin, and smiled for the first time in months. Marcus Pemberton thought he was dealing with a helpless old woman with nowhere to go. He had no idea that Victoria Blackwood was just getting started. Tomorrow I would make my first call. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning I woke to the sound of Marcus's BMW purring to life in the driveway. Through the garage window I watched him adjust his Italian leather tie in the rearview mirror before pulling away from the house on Rosewood Lane. Even his morning routine radiated the kind of calculated perfection that had initially impressed Sophia but now made my skin crawl. I had built a life in this town of Millbrook Springs, population 45,000, nestled in the rolling hills of northern Pennsylvania. For 30 years I'd been Victoria Blackwood of Blackwood Interiors, the woman who could transform any space into something extraordinary. My client list had included the mayor's mansion, the country club's main dining room, and homes belonging to 3 state senators. I wasn't just another interior designer, I was the interior designer in our corner of the state. Thomas had been my anchor through it all. Where I was creative and intuitive, he was practical and grounded. He'd worked as the head maintenance supervisor for the Millbrook Springs School District, a job that might not have impressed the country club set, but provided steady income and excellent benefits. More importantly, Thomas understood that success wasn't measured only in dollar signs. He'd supported my business dreams when other husbands might have been threatened by their wives' ambitions. Victoria's got the vision, he used to tell people with genuine pride. I just make sure the lights stay on so she can work her magic. We'd bought the Victorian house on Rosewood Lane in 1985, when Sophia was just 3 years old. It had been a disaster then, peeling paint, outdated plumbing, a kitchen from the 1940s that barely functioned. But I'd seen the potential in those high ceilings, the original hardwood floors, the intricate crown molding that just needed love and attention. Over the years we'd transformed it room by room. I'd designed every detail myself, from the custom built-ins in the library to the master bathroom that had been featured in Country Home magazine in 2000. Thomas had learned carpentry, plumbing, and electrical work just to keep up with my vision. Together we'd created something beautiful, Not just a house, but a home that told the story of our family. Sophia had grown up in that house, in rooms designed specifically for her changing needs. The nursery with its hand-painted mural, the childhood bedroom with built-in reading nooks and secret storage compartments, the teenage suite we'd created in the converted attic, complete with her own sitting area where she'd spent hours on the phone with friends. She'd been our miracle baby, born after years of fertility struggles and 2 heartbreaking miscarriages. Perhaps that's why we'd spoiled her, not with money, which we never had in abundance, but with attention, with opportunities, with the absolute certainty that she was loved beyond measure. Sophia had been brilliant, creative, and kind. She'd inherited my eye for design and Thomas's steady temperament. In high school, she'd helped me with smaller projects, learning to see spaces the way I did. She'd gone to art school on a partial scholarship, the rest covered by money I'd carefully saved from my most profitable projects. After graduation, she'd moved to Philadelphia to work for a prestigious design firm. For 8 years, she'd built her own reputation, sending me photos of projects and calling every Sunday to share stories about difficult clients and impossible deadlines. She dated casually but never seriously, always claiming she hadn't found anyone who measured up to her father. Then Thomas got sick. The diagnosis had come out of nowhere, stage 4 lung cancer, despite the fact that he'd never smoked a day in his life. Environmental exposure, the doctors said, vaguely, possibly from years of working in old-school buildings with asbestos insulation. By the time they caught it, there was nothing to do but try to buy time. Sophia had moved back home immediately, taking a leave of absence from her job to help care for her father. For 6 months, we'd been a team again, taking shifts at the hospital, navigating insurance paperwork, researching treatments that might give us hope. She'd been the daughter I'd raised, compassionate, strong, unwavering in her devotion to family. Thomas died on a Thursday morning in March, 2 years ago. Sophia and I had been holding his hands when he slipped away, and in that moment, I'd thought our shared grief would bring us closer together. For a while it did. We planned the funeral together, sorted through his belongings, figured out how to navigate a world without the man who had been our foundation. But grief is a strange thing. Where I eventually found ways to honor Thomas's memory while moving forward, Sophia seemed trapped in amber, unable to imagine a future that didn't include her father's guidance. She'd resigned from her Philadelphia job, claiming she needed to stay close to home, to help me manage the house and the business. I'd tried to tell her that wasn't necessary. At 69, I was still sharp, still capable, still running Blackwood interiors with the same attention to detail that had built my reputation. But Sophia had insisted, and I'd been so grateful for her presence that I hadn't pushed back. That's when Marcus had appeared. They'd met at Greenfield Gallery, during a local art show where Sophia was half-heartedly looking for pieces to use in a small project I'd assigned her. Marcus had been there with friends, impeccably dressed, and charming in that smooth way that some women find irresistible. He'd approached her while she was studying a landscape painting, offering insights about the artist's technique that revealed both knowledge and wealth. He really seems to understand art, Sophia had told me after their first coffee date, and he's so worldly, Mom. He's traveled everywhere, speaks 3 languages. He makes me feel like maybe there's a bigger world out there than just Millbrook Springs. I should have recognized the warning signs. The subtle way Marcus began criticizing our small town as quaint but limited. His suggestions that Sophia was too talented to waste her gifts on local projects. His pointed observations about how different her life could be with the right partner, the right connections, the right opportunity. Within 3 months, Sophia was spending more time at Marcus's penthouse apartment in Willowbrook Heights than she was at home. Within 6 months, she'd announced their engagement at a party thrown by his wealthy friends, people I'd never met, in a world I'd never been invited to enter. The wedding had been everything I'd never imagined for my daughter: elaborate, expensive, and cold. Marcus had insisted on hiring a wedding planner from New York City, dismissing my offer to help design the floral arrangements or reception decor. "Mother Blackwood," he'd said with that patronizing smile, "this is really more complex than residential interior design. We need someone with experience in high-end event management." Standing in the garage now, remembering how small he'd made me feel that day, I clenched my fist. Marcus had been systematically erasing me from Sophia's life since the day they'd met, but he'd been so subtle about it that my daughter couldn't see the pattern. What Marcus didn't understand was that I hadn't built Blackwood interiors by being easily dismissed. I hadn't survived 30 years in a competitive industry by backing down when men underestimated me, and I hadn't quietly acquired 3 valuable properties by being the helpless old woman he believed me to be. I looked around the garage that had become my prison, then at the house where I'd raised my daughter and built my dreams. Marcus thought he'd won. He thought he'd successfully marginalized the inconvenient mother-in-law who didn't fit his vision of Sophia's new life. He had no idea what was coming. The morning after Thomas's funeral had been when everything truly began to unravel. Though I hadn't recognized it at the time, I was sitting in the kitchen, still in my black dress from the service, staring at a cup of coffee that had grown cold hours earlier. The house felt impossibly quiet without Thomas's presence. No morning news program murmuring from the living room, no sound of him humming while he made his breakfast. Sophia had stayed the night, sleeping in her old room for the first time in years. I'd been grateful for her presence, for the illusion that our family unit might somehow continue even with one crucial member missing. When she'd appeared in the doorway that morning, her eyes red-rimmed and her hair uncombed, I'd felt a surge of maternal protectiveness that reminded me of her childhood. "Mom," she'd said, settling into the chair across from me, "we need to talk about practical things, about what happens next." I'd nodded, expecting conversations about insurance policies, about whether I wanted to keep working, about how we'd manage the holidays without Thomas. Instead, Sophia had pulled out a legal pad covered with notes in her careful handwriting. "I've been thinking about your situation," she'd continued, and something in her tone made me sit up straighter. "You're going to be alone in this big house now. It's a lot of maintenance, a lot of expense. Maybe this is an opportunity to simplify your life." The word simplify had hit me like a slap. My life wasn't complicated. It was full of work I loved, clients who depended on me, a home that represented decades of careful investment and improvement, but I'd kept these thoughts to myself, assuming grief was making Sophia speak carelessly. "I can manage the house just fine," I'd said gently. "Your father and I planned for this possibility. I have savings, and the business is still profitable." Sophia had looked uncomfortable then, shifting in her chair and avoiding my eyes. "But Mom, you're almost 7. Don't you think it's time to slow down, maybe consider somewhere with less responsibility? There are some beautiful retirement communities in the area, places where you could make friends with people your own age." That's when I'd realized this conversation hadn't originated with Sophia. The language, the suggestions, even the legal pad with its organized talking points, none of it sounded like my daughter. It sounded like someone had coached her, given her a script for managing the inconvenient widow. "Has someone been advising you about my living situation?" I'd asked carefully. The flush that crept up Sophia's neck had been answer enough. "Marcus and I have discussed it," she'd admitted. "He has experience with these kinds of transitions. His grandmother made a similar move a few years ago, and she's much happier now." Marcus, of course. They'd been dating for only 4 months at that point, but apparently long enough for him to have opinions about my future. I'd met him exactly 3 times, once at a restaurant, where he'd spent the entire dinner checking his phone, once at a gallery opening, where he'd corrected my comments about a painting I'd actually commissioned for a client, and once at our house, where he'd walked through my carefully designed rooms, making suggestions for updating them. "Sophia," I'd said slowly, "Marcus barely knows me. How can he possibly advise you about what's best for my life? He's just trying to be helpful," she'd insisted, but I could hear the defensiveness creeping into her voice. "He's dealt with elderly relatives before. He understands the challenges." Elderly relative. At 69, I was apparently being categorized as a challenge to be managed rather than a person with agency over her own decisions. The casual cruelty of it had taken my breath away. "I'm not elderly, and I'm not a challenge," I'd said firmly. "I'm a grown woman who has successfully managed her own life for 7 decades. I don't need a man I've met 3 times making decisions about my future." That's when Sophia had revealed the true scope of Marcus's influence. "He's not making decisions, he's just pointing out options that you might not have considered, like the fact that this house is way too big for one person, like the fact that maintaining a business at your age," might be more stressful than rewarding, like the fact that you might be lonely, living here by yourself. Each suggestion had been wrapped in concern, presented as if Marcus's observations were motivated by care for my well-being, rather than a desire to reshape my daughter's life, according to his preferences. And Sophia, in her grief and vulnerability, had absorbed these ideas as if they were her own insights, rather than manipulations from a man who wanted her free of family obligations. Over the following weeks, Marcus's campaign had intensified. He'd started joining Sophia for her visits to my house, always with helpful suggestions about how I might streamline my life. The guest bedroom where Sophia stayed when she visited was really more space than necessary for occasional use. The home office where I managed Blackwood interiors could be converted to something more relaxing now that I was winding down my career. The formal dining room was impractical for a single person, and might work better as a meditation space or reading room. Each conversation had chipped away at Sophia's connection to the house where she'd grown up, reframing our family home as an outdated burden, rather than a repository of love and memory. Marcus had been particularly skilled at highlighting maintenance issues, the windows that needed resealing, the roof that would eventually need replacement, the heating system that was inefficient by modern standards. "Mom, Marcus is in real estate development," Sophia had explained during one of these visits. "He knows about property management. He's just trying to help you see the practical side of things." But I'd recognized what Marcus really was, a predator who had identified a grieving woman with valuable assets, and positioned himself to influence her decisions through her vulnerable daughter. His suggestions weren't about my welfare, they were about removing obstacles to his control over Sophia's life, and by extension her inheritance. The engagement had been announced 6 months after Thomas's death, at a party I wasn't invited to because Marcus thought it would be less emotional for Sophia if I wasn't there. I'd learned about my daughter's engagement from Martha Hendricks, my neighbor who'd seen the announcement in the society pages of the Willowbrook Heights Gazette. "I'm sure Sophia planned to tell you personally," Martha had said gently, though we both knew that wasn't true. Maybe she just got caught up in the excitement, but there had been no excitement when Sophia finally came to tell me. She'd sat in the same kitchen chair where she'd first suggested I simplify my life, wearing a ring I'd never seen before, looking guilty and defiant in equal measure. "Marcus proposed last weekend," she'd said without preamble. "We're thinking a fall wedding, something small and intimate." I'd stared at my daughter, this woman I'd raised to be independent and thoughtful, and seen a stranger. 6 months, I'd said quietly. "You've known him 6 months, and 4 of those months you were grieving your father." "I know it seems fast," Sophia had replied, "but when you find the right person, timing doesn't matter." "Marcus makes me feel safe, Mom, protected, like I don't have to figure everything out by myself." That's when I'd understood the true genius of Marcus's manipulation. He hadn't just convinced Sophia to fall in love with him, he'd convinced her that independence was a burden, rather than a strength, that needing guidance was feminine rather than that his control was protection rather than manipulation. The wedding planning had been a masterclass in gradual exclusion. First, Marcus had suggested that a destination wedding might be more romantic, eliminating the possibility of using our family church where Thomas and I had been married. Then he'd recommended a wedding planner who specialized in sophisticated celebrations, dismissing my offer to help with design and coordination as unnecessary. Finally, he'd convinced Sophia that a small ceremony would be more meaningful, which translated to a guest list dominated by his friends and colleagues, while my side of the family was reduced to a handful of essential relatives. I'd watched my daughter transform from a grieving woman seeking comfort into a bride who deferred to her fiancé's preferences on every decision. The Sophia who had once spent hours debating paint colors with me now nodded agreeably when Marcus chose everything from her wedding dress to the honeymoon destination. Standing in the garage now, 18 months after that first conversation about simplifying my life, I could see the entire arc of Marcus's strategy. He'd identified my close relationship with Sophia as a threat to his control, and systematically worked to weaken it. He'd presented himself as a protector while actually isolating her from her support system. He'd convinced her that loving him meant distancing herself from me, and I'd let it happen. I'd been so focused on respecting Sophia's choices, so determined not to be the interfering mother-in-law, that I'd failed to recognize how thoroughly I was being erased from my daughter's life. But Marcus had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that a 71-year-old widow would be easy to manipulate, that I'd quietly accept whatever role he assigned me in his version of Sophia's life. He had no idea that Victoria Blackwood had been making strategic decisions and building hidden assets for decades. He had no idea that the helpless old woman sleeping in his garage was actually worth more than he could imagine. Tomorrow, I would begin to show him exactly how wrong he'd been. The changes had started so subtly that I'd almost convinced myself I was imagining them. 3 weeks after Sophia and Marcus returned from their honeymoon in Tuscany, I'd walked into my own kitchen to find Marcus reorganizing my spice cabinet, not helping, not suggesting, actually removing jars and bottles and arranging them according to some system of his own devising. "Good morning, Mother Blackwood," he'd said without looking up from his task. The title itself was a small violence, formal distancing, nothing like the mom that Sophia's previous boyfriends had eventually adopted. "I hope you don't mind, but I noticed your spices weren't organized alphabetically. It's much more efficient this way." I'd stood in the doorway of my own kitchen watching this man handle jars I'd collected over decades of cooking. The saffron I'd bought for Sophia's birthday paella 2 years ago. The cardamom pods Thomas had picked up during a business trip to Minneapolis. The vanilla extract I'd been treasuring since a client gave it to me from Madagascar. Marcus was handling them like inventory items, not understanding that each jar held memories. "I had my own system," I'd said carefully, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. I knew where everything was. Marcus had finally looked up, flashing that practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Of course you did. But this way, if Sophia needs something while cooking, she won't have to guess where you've put things. It's more intuitive for everyone." The implication was clear. My organizational methods were illogical, inconvenient for the people who really mattered. But he delivered the criticism wrapped in concern for Sophia's convenience, making it seem unreasonable for me to object. That afternoon, I'd found Sophia in the garden deadheading the roses Thomas had planted along the back fence. She'd always loved working in the garden with her father, and I'd hoped this activity might give us a chance to reconnect. Marcus reorganized my spice cabinet today, I'd mentioned casually, testing the waters. Sophia had paused in her work, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly. "He's just trying to be helpful, Mom. He's used to things being organized a certain way. It's my kitchen, hun. I've been organizing it my way for 25 years. "I know, but..." Sophia had trailed off, then straightened with a defensive set to her shoulders. "Look, Marcus has experience managing multiple properties. He knows about efficient organization. Maybe we could learn something from him." Multiple properties. That was new information, delivered in a tone that suggested I should be impressed rather than wondering why my son-in-law felt qualified to reorganize my home because he owned real estate. But I'd let it pass, not wanting to create conflict so early in their marriage. The next warning sign had come during my weekly coffee date with my longtime friend, Helen Rossman. We'd been meeting every Thursday morning at Cafe Luna for 8 years, ever since her husband Robert had died. It was a tradition that had sustained us both through grief, business challenges, and the ordinary difficulties of aging in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to older women. I'd been looking forward to telling Helen about my latest project, a complete renovation of the Millbrook Springs Library that would modernize the space while preserving its historic character. It was exactly the kind of challenging, meaningful work that energized me, and I'd been excited to share the preliminary sketches. But when I'd arrived at our usual table by the window, Helen had looked troubled. "Victoria, I saw Sophia at the grocery store yesterday," she'd said without preamble. I tried to say hello, but she seemed different, distant. And that husband of hers was steering her around like she couldn't make her own decisions about which bread to buy. I'd felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "What do you mean, steering?" His hand was on her back the entire time, guiding her down each aisle. When I approached them, he stepped slightly in front of her, not obviously, but enough to control the conversation. "When I asked about how you were adjusting to living with them." Sophia looked uncomfortable. "She said you were finding your place in their household." finding my place, as if I were a newly adopted pet rather than the woman who had raised Sophia in the house where they were now living. "Helen, you're reading too much into it," I'd said, though I was beginning to wonder if I'd been reading too little into things. "They're still newlywed. They're probably just very focused on each other." But Helen had shaken her gray head firmly. "Victoria, I've been married and widowed. I know what newlywed behavior looks like, and I know what control looks like. That man was managing your daughter like she was an employee, not a wife." Over the following weeks, I'd started paying closer attention to the small interactions between Sophia and Marcus, and what I'd seen had disturbed me more each day. Marcus had opinions about everything: which books Sophia should read, which friends she should maintain contact with, how she should spend her time when he was at work. More troubling, Sophia had begun deferring to these opinions as if they were more valid than her own instinct. "Marcus thinks I should consider going back to school," she'd mentioned one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "Maybe get an MBA. He says my art background is creative, but not practical for building a real career." I'd looked up from loading the dishwasher. "Sophia, you have a successful career. You worked for Peterson and Associates for 8 years before moving back home. You have experience, contacts, skills." But Marcus says the design industry is saturated with people who have artistic vision but no business sense. He thinks I could do better in corporate management, maybe work for one of his development companies eventually. The casual way she'd dismissed her own expertise, her own interests in favor of Marcus's vision for her future had been chilling. This wasn't a woman making informed choices about career development. This was someone being systematically convinced that her own judgment was inadequate. The social isolation had been even more insidious. Friends who had been regular fixtures in Sophia's life had gradually stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped being mentioned in conversation. When I'd asked about Caroline Fisher, Sophia's best friend since college, my daughter had shrugged dismissive. "Caroline and I are in different places in our lives now," she'd said. "She's still single, still going to bars and dating random guys. Marcus thinks I've outgrown that whole scene." Marcus, the phrase had become Sophia's constant refrain, preceding every decision from major life choices to what she ordered at restaurants. It was as if my independent, thoughtful daughter had been replaced by someone who couldn't trust her own preferences without external validation. The most heartbreaking change had been in Sophia's relationship with me. We'd always been close, sharing everything from work frustrations to relationship challenges, but gradually our conversations had become stilted, superficial, as if she were editing herself for an invisible audience. When I'd shared my excitement about the library project, Sophia's response had been lukewarm. "That's nice, Mom. Just make sure you're not taking on more than you can handle at your age." "At my age," another phrase that had crept into her vocabulary, always delivered with a slight note of concern that felt more like condescension. The daughter who had once admired my energy and capability was now speaking to me as if I were declining rather than simply getting older. The breaking point had come during Thanksgiving dinner, our first major holiday as an extended family. I'd been cooking Thanksgiving dinner in that kitchen for 25 years, and I'd planned to prepare the same menu Thomas and Sophia had always loved: herb-crusted turkey, cornbread stuffing, green bean casserole made from my mother's recipe. But Marcus had arrived that morning with grocery bags full of different ingredients. "I thought we'd try something more sophisticated this year," he'd announced, unpacking items I'd never seen before: duck instead of turkey, quinoa stuffing with dried cranberries, some kind of Brussels sprouts dish that looked like it belonged in a restaurant rather than a family kitchen. "Marcus," I'd said carefully, "I've already prepared everything. The turkey is in the oven." He'd paused in his unpacking, fixing me with a patient smile that somehow managed to be deeply patronizing. "Mother Blackwood, I appreciate that you're used to doing things a certain way, but Sophia and I thought it might be nice to elevate the meal a bit, create some new traditions." Sophia had been standing behind him, and when I'd looked to her for support, she'd avoided my eyes. "Mom, maybe we could try Marcus's menu this year. The turkey will keep, we can have it another time." Another time, as if Thanksgiving dinner was something that could be rescheduled rather than the culmination of days of planning and preparation. As if my decades of creating holiday memories for our family were just stubborn habits that needed update. I'd stood in my own kitchen, looking at the turkey I'd been basting since dawn, at the pies cooling on the counter at the carefully set table with my grandmother's china, and realized that Marcus wasn't just changing our menu. He was changing our family's story, replacing our traditions with his preferences, erasing my role as the matriarch who had held our holidays together. That night, lying in the guest room that was about to become my temporary home before eventually becoming my garage prison, I'd finally understood what Helen had been trying to tell me. Marcus wasn't just a controlling husband, he was a man systematically dismantling my daughter's sense of self and my place in her life. But I'd still believed I could fight back through patience, through maintaining my dignity, through proving my worth through small acts of service and care. I'd still thought this was a problem that could be solved through communication and compromise. I'd had no idea how much worse things were about to become. By February, Marcus had moved beyond subtle manipulations and begun what I could only describe as a systematic campaign to erase my presence from the house entirely. It started with the library, the room Thomas and I had created by converting what was originally meant to be a formal sitting area. We'd knocked out a wall, installed floor-to-ceiling built-in bookshelves, and created a cozy reading nook with a window seat that overlooked the garden. I'd come downstairs one Tuesday morning to find contractors in the library, measuring walls and discussing what appeared to be a complete renovation. "What's happening here?" I'd asked the foreman, a weathered man in his 50s, who looked uncomfortable with my question. "Miss Pemberton hired us to convert this space into a home office," he'd replied, consulting his clipboard. "Complete gut renovation, remove the built-ins, install modern cabinetry, update the electrical for multiple computer workstations." My heart had sunk as I looked at the bookshelves Thomas had custom built, the window seat where Sophia had spent countless hours reading as a child, the carefully chosen paint color that complemented the morning light. All of it was apparently going to be destroyed to create workspace for Marcus's business ventures. "Where are the books supposed to go?" I'd asked weakly. The foreman had shrugged. "Mr. Pemberton said most of them were outdated anyway. Said to donate whatever fits in a few boxes, dispose of the rest." Outdated. Thomas's collection of historical biographies, my design reference books that I still consulted regularly, first edition novels we'd collected over decades of marriage, all dismissed as clutter that needed to be eliminated for Marcus's convenience. When I'd confronted Sophia about the renovation, she'd been defensive but clearly uncomfortable with my questions. "Marcus needs a proper office space if he's going to work from home more often," she'd explained, not meeting my eyes. "The library wasn't really being used anyway." "Not being used, Sophia. I'm in there every morning reading the newspaper. I use those reference books for my design projects. That's where I keep all my client portfolios. We can set up a small desk for you in the basement," she'd offered half-heartedly. "There's plenty of space down there." The basement. The damp, poorly lit basement where Thomas had stored lawn equipment and Christmas decorations. The message was clear. My needs were secondary, my comfort irrelevant, my decades of accumulated books and materials disposable obstacles to Marcus's vision for our home. But the library renovation was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, Marcus had systematically targeted every space in the house that represented my history or interest. The dining room, where I'd hosted holiday dinners and client meetings for 25 years, was declared too formal for modern living. The china cabinet that displayed my grandmother's dishes was removed to make room for a sleek bar cart stocked with expensive whiskey and wine. "People don't do formal dining anymore, Mother Blackwood," Marcus had explained when I'd questioned the changes. "It's much more practical to have a space where we can entertain business associates casually." My grandmother's china, the same dishes I'd carefully hand-washed after every special occasion, the plates that had served Sophia's birthday cakes and Christmas dinners, was packed away in boxes and relegated to the basement storage room. In their place, Marcus had installed modern white dishes that looked elegant but cold, functional but devoid of history. The garden had been next. Thomas's roses, the vegetables patch where Sophia had learned to identify tomato plants, the herb garden I'd maintained for 30 years, all of it was suddenly high maintenance and inefficient use of space. Marcus hired a landscaping company to replace everything with what he called low-maintenance modern plantings. I'd watched from the kitchen window as strangers dug up Thomas's carefully tended rose bushes, the ones he'd planted to mark each anniversary of our marriage. 30 roses, one for each year we'd been together, uprooted and discarded like weeds. In their place, the landscapers installed geometric planters filled with ornamental grasses and sculptural plants that looked striking but felt sterile. "It's much cleaner this way," Marcus had said, standing beside me as we watched the destruction. "And Sophia won't have to worry about maintenance when you're no longer able to help with the gardening. When you're no longer able." Another casual reference to my supposed decline, another assumption that my capabilities were diminishing rather than simply being dismissed. Marcus had a talent for making his takeover of my home sound like preparation for my inevitable deterioration rather than acknowledgement that he simply didn't value what Thomas and I had created. The most heartbreaking change had been Sophia's bedroom, not her current bedroom with Marcus, but her childhood room that had remained largely unchanged since she'd left for college. I'd preserved it as a connection to her past, a reminder of the young woman who had filled our house with laughter and dreams. Marcus had decided it would make a better guest suite for his business associates. "Sophia doesn't need a shrine to her childhood," he'd announced matter of fact. "She's a married woman now. It's time to move forward rather than clinging to the past." The room that had once been painted pale yellow with hand-stenciled flowers around the ceiling, a design Sophia and I had worked on together during her sophomore year of high school, was repainted a sterile beige. The built-in desk where she'd done homework, the bookshelf that held her collection of young adult novels, the bulletin board covered with photos of friends and family memories, all of it was removed and replaced with generic hotel-style furniture. I'd found some of Sophia's belongings in boxes in the basement, including photo albums from her childhood and art projects she'd made in elementary school. When I'd brought them upstairs suggesting we at least save these memories, Marcus had looked at them with thinly disguised impatience. "Mother Blackwood, you can't keep every piece of paper a child brings home from school. It's just clutter. Sophia has moved on from all of that." But when I'd looked at Sophia hoping for some indication that she wanted to preserve these connections to her past, she'd simply shrugged. "Marcus is right, Mom. I don't need all that old stuff. We should focus on our future, not the past." Our future, the possessive pronoun that excluded me completely, reducing me to a caretaker of outdated memories while they built something new that had no place for what came before. The isolation had become physical as well as emotional. Marcus had installed a security system that required codes for entry, codes that he changed regularly without always informing me. I'd been locked out of my own house twice, forced to wait in the cold until Sophia returned from errands to let me in. "It's for safety," Marcus had explained when I'd protested. "This is an expensive neighborhood. We need to protect our investment." Our investment, as if the house Thomas and I had bought and improved over decades had somehow become Marcus's property through marriage to my daughter. My clients had begun to notice changes too. Miss Patterson, for whom I was designing a sunroom addition, had called to express concern after Marcus had answered my business phone and told her I was scaling back my workload due to health issues. "Victoria, I hope you don't mind me saying this," Miss Patterson had said when I'd called her back, "but that man who answered your phone made it sound like you were practically on your deathbed. Should I be looking for another designer?" I'd assured her that I was perfectly capable of completing her project, but the conversation had shaken me. Marcus was actively sabotaging my business relationships, spreading the narrative that I was in decline even to my professional contact. The final humiliation had come when Marcus announced that his parents would be visiting for an extended stay 3 months, while they decided whether to relocate to Pennsylvania from their retirement community in Florida. "They'll need the guest suite, of course," he'd informed me over breakfast one morning in March. "I've arranged for a comfortable space for you in the converted garage. It has heat and running water, everything you need, everything I need." As if sleeping in a garage was a reasonable accommodation for a 71-year-old woman in her own home, as if my comfort and dignity were negotiable in service of his family's convenience. When I'd looked to Sophia for support for any indication that she found this arrangement as outrageous as I did, she'd simply said, "It's only temporary, Mom, and honestly, you might enjoy having your own private space." A euphemism for exile that made my banishment sound like a privilege rather than a punishment. That night, as I'd packed my belongings into suitcases for the move to the garage, I'd realized that Marcus's campaign wasn't just about controlling Sophia or taking over our house. It was about systematically erasing my existence, reducing me to such a minimal presence that my eventual complete removal would seem natural, inevitable, almost merciful. standing in the garage now, 3 months later. I could see the entire arc of his strategy. Every change, every renovation, every casual cruelty had been designed to make me feel like an unwelcome guest in my own life. He'd bet that I would eventually break, that I would suggest my own departure rather than continue to endure the systematic humiliation. Marcus had counted on my pride, my dignity, my desire to avoid conflict with my daughter. He'd assumed that a woman my age would eventually surrender rather than fight back. He had no idea how badly he'd miscalculated. The pneumonia hit me in early October, 3 weeks after the first frost had turned the garage into what felt like a walk-in refrigerator. I'd been fighting a persistent cough for over a month, dismissing it as a minor cold that would resolve itself with rest and warm tea. But rest was impossible in a space where the temperature dropped to near freezing every night, and the single space heater Marcus had provided barely warmed a 3-foot radius around my cot. I woke up on a Tuesday morning unable to catch my breath, my chest feeling like someone had placed a concrete block on my rib cage. The fever had spiked overnight, leaving me disoriented and shivering uncontrollably despite being wrapped in every blanket I owned. When I tried to stand, the room spun violently, and I had to grip the metal shelving unit to keep from falling. Through the garage window I could see Marcus leaving for work, adjusting his Italian wool coat against the October chill before sliding into his heated BMW. The contrast wasn't lost on me. He was protecting himself from the same cold that was literally making me sick, while I was expected to endure it as a reasonable living condition. It took me 3 attempts to walk the 20 feet from my cot to the garage door that led into the house. Each step sent sharp pains through my chest, and I had to stop twice to rest against the concrete wall. When I finally reached the door, I found it locked, another of Marcus's recent security improvements that required a code I didn't have. I knocked weakly, then more forcefully when no one answered. Through the frosted glass I could see Sophia moving around the kitchen, preparing breakfast in the warm, comfortable space that had once been my domain. I knocked again, harder this time, and finally saw her approach the door. "Mom, what's wrong?" she asked, though she made no move to open the door immediately. "You look terrible." "I'm sick, Sophia, really sick. I need to see a doctor." She hesitated, glancing back toward the kitchen where I could see Marcus still finishing his coffee. "Are you sure it's not just a cold? You've been complaining about not feeling well for weeks." Complaining, as if my concerns about living in an unheated garage during Pennsylvania winter were unreasonable grievances rather than legitimate health concerns. "Sophia, I can barely breathe. I have a fever, please." She finally unlocked the door, and I stumbled into the blessed warmth of the kitchen. The contrast was so stark that I actually felt dizzy from the sudden temperature change. Marcus looked up from his newspaper with obvious irritation. "Mother Blackwood, you're dripping wet, and you're getting water all over the floor." I looked down and realized he was right. I was soaked in perspiration from the fever, and melted frost from my hair was indeed dripping onto the kitchen tiles I'd mopped countless times over the year. "I'm sorry," I managed between labored breaths. "I'm very sick. I think I need to go to the emergency room." Marcus set down his newspaper with the exaggerated patience of someone dealing with a difficult child. "Let's not be dramatic. It's probably just a seasonal bug. Why don't you take some aspirin and go back to bed?" Go back to bed, in the garage where the temperature was currently 38 degrees and dropping. "Marcus," Sophia said quietly. "She really doesn't look well." "Sophia, your mother has been claiming various ailments since she moved to the garage," he replied dismissively. "Headaches, joint pain, fatigue. There's always something. At her age, these complaints are normal. We can't rush to the emergency room every time she feels under the weather." At her age, the phrase that had become his standard dismissal of any concern I raised, any need I expressed, any discomfort I experienced, as if reaching 71 had somehow invalidated my right to basic medical care or reasonable living conditions. I tried to respond, but a coughing fit doubled me over. When I finally straightened up, I saw flecks of blood on my hand. Sophia gasped, but Marcus barely glanced up from his newspaper. "That's just from coughing too hard," he said matter-of-factly. "Happens all the time with bronchitis." But Sophia had seen the blood too, and something in her expression shifted. For a moment I caught a glimpse of the daughter I'd raised, the one who would have been horrified to see her mother struggling to breathe in a freezing garage. "Mom, let me drive you to Dr. Martinez's office," she said suddenly, moving toward the coat closet. Marcus's head snapped up. "Sophia, I don't think that's necessary. Your mother is perfectly capable of managing a minor respiratory infection. She's lived through 71 winters, not in a garage." I wheezed, the words barely audible. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in months, I'd spoken the truth plainly, without euphemisms or careful phrasing designed to avoid conflict. I was living in a garage, and it was making me seriously ill. Marcus's expression hardened. "The garage is properly heated and ventilated. If you're uncomfortable, perhaps you should consider other living arrangements that might better suit your health needs." Other living arrangements. The threat that had been lurking beneath all our interactions for months, finally spoken aloud. Get sicker, 'cause more trouble, and I'd be shipped off to some institutional care facility, where I'd become someone else's problem. Dr. Martinez's diagnosis was exactly what I'd feared. Pneumonia complicated by chronic exposure to cold and damp conditions. My oxygen levels were dangerously low. My immune system was compromised from stress and poor living conditions, and I needed immediate treatment, including prescription antibiotics and possibly hospitalization. "Mrs. Blackwood," Martinez said gently after reviewing my chest X-rays, "I need to ask about your current living situation. Your symptoms suggest prolonged exposure to cold, damp conditions. Are you having heating problems in your home?" I glanced at Sophia, who was sitting in the corner of the examination room, looking increasingly uncomfortable. How could I explain that my home had excellent heating, but I wasn't allowed to live in it? "I'm staying in a converted garage space," I said carefully. "It has a space heater." Martinez frowned. "Mrs. Blackwood, a space heater is not adequate heating for someone your age, especially during Pennsylvania winters. You need consistent, adequate heat and humidity control. Continued exposure to these conditions could lead to more serious complications." "What kind of complications?" Sophia asked, speaking for the first time since we'd arrived. "Worsening pneumonia, potential heart complications from the stress on her system, increased risk of falls from weakness and disorientation." Dr. Martinez listed matter-of-factly. "At minimum, Miss Blackwood needs to be in a properly heated, dry environment while she recovers, preferably for the remainder of the winter season." The drive home was silent, except for my labored breathing and the occasional cough that made Sophia wince. I could see her wrestling with herself, probably trying to figure out how to present Dr. Martinez's recommendations to Marcus in a way that wouldn't create conflict. When we arrived at the house, Marcus was waiting in the kitchen with what looked like a stack of brochures spread across the table. "How did the doctor visit go?" he asked with false concern. "She has pneumonia," Sophia replied quietly. "The doctor says the garage isn't suitable for someone her age, especially during winter." Marcus nodded as if this confirmed something he'd been expecting. "Well, that settles it then. I've been researching assisted living facilities in the area." He gestured to the brochures. "Several of them have immediate openings and excellent medical care. Golden Meadows has particularly good reviews." I stared at him, understanding finally crystallizing through my fever-clouded thought. This had been his plan all along. Drive me to the point of illness, then use that illness as justification for removing me from the house entirely. The garage had been a temporary strategy designed to create exactly this situation. "Marcus," Sophia said hesitantly, "maybe we could just move Mom back into the guest room until she recovers." "Sophia, be realistic," Marcus replied smoothly. "Your mother is 71 years old with pneumonia. She needs professional medical supervision, not amateur nursing from people with no medical training. What if her condition worsens? What if she falls and hurts herself? Could you live with that responsibility?" The way he framed it made any objection seem selfish and irresponsible. Of course Sophia couldn't provide professional medical care. Of course she would worry about my safety. Of course the logical solution was to transfer me to a facility designed for elderly people with health problems. "I don't need assisted living," I said, though my voice was weak and my words were punctuated by coughing. "I need adequate heating and a real bed." Marcus smiled, that patient. condescending smile I'd grown to hate. Mother Blackwood, denial is common among older adults facing health crises, but we need to think practically about what's best for everyone involved. That evening, as I lay on my cot in the garage with a prescription for antibiotics and strict instructions to rest in a warm, dry environment, I realized I had reached the absolute bottom of my decline. I was sick, isolated, and facing imminent exile to an institution where Marcus could visit occasionally to maintain appearances while having complete control over Sophia and our family home. Through the garage window I could see them in the warm, well-lit kitchen, Marcus showing Sophia more brochures while she nodded reluctantly. They were planning my future without me, discussing my care as if I were an elderly pet that had become too much trouble to keep. But as I watched them making decisions about my life, something shifted inside me. The fever might have weakened my body, but it had also burned away the last of my illusions about Marcus's intentions and Sophia's ability to protect me from them. Tomorrow, regardless of how sick I felt, I would make the phone call that would change everything. Because Victoria Blackwood wasn't going quietly into any nursing home, no matter how comfortable Marcus tried to make it sound. I had endured enough. I woke up at 5:30 in the morning with perfect clarity for the first time in weeks. The fever had broken sometime during the night, leaving me weak but mentally sharp in a way that felt almost supernatural. As I lay on the narrow cot listening to the wind rattle the garage door, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. I was done being a victim. The realization came not with anger or desperation but with the cold calculation that had once made me successful in business. Marcus had played his hand perfectly, systematically dismantling my life until this moment when I was supposed to accept defeat gracefully. He'd counted on my love for Sophia, my desire to avoid conflict, my internalized ideas about what was appropriate behavior for a woman my age. But Marcus had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that because I was 71 and living in a garage, I was powerless. I reached for my purse, hands steadier than they'd been in days, and pulled out the small address book I'd carried for decades. The leather cover was worn smooth from handling, and many of the entries were written in faded ink, but the information I needed was there, carefully preserved through years of moves and updates. James Morrison, real estate attorney, the man who had handled the legal work when I'd quietly purchased my 3 properties over the past 15 years. James had been recommended to me by another client back in 2008, when I'd first decided to invest some of my business profits in real estate. He was discreet, efficient, and had never questioned why a successful interior designer wanted to purchase properties through a business entity that kept her name off public record. Smart planning, he'd said when I'd explained that I wanted these investments to remain private, even from my family. Women of your generation often find it wise to maintain some financial independence, even in the happiest marriages. James had understood, without my having to explain, that these weren't investments I was hiding from Thomas out of distrust, but rather a safety net I was building for circumstances I hoped would never arrive. Thomas had been a good man and a faithful husband, but I'd seen too many women of my generation left financially vulnerable when their spouses died or became incapacitated. Now, 15 years later, that foresight was about to save my life. The first property was the cottage on Maple Lake, purchased in 2009 for $180,000, and now worth close to $400,000 according to recent comparable sales in the area. It was a charming 2-bedroom place with a stone fireplace and a wraparound porch, surrounded by mature oak trees that provided privacy from the seasonal neighbors. I'd visited it exactly once after the purchase, telling Thomas I was meeting a client for a consultation. It had been everything I'd hoped: peaceful, self-contained, and completely mine. The second property was the duplex in Millbrook's historic district, purchased in 2012 for $200,000. Both units were currently rented to long-term tenants who paid a combined total of $2,000. After expenses, the property generated nearly $28,000 in annual income that was deposited directly into a business account I monitored online, but rarely accessed. Over the years, that money had accumulated into a substantial emergency fund. The third property was the commercial building downtown that housed Riverstone Cafe and the Book Nook. I'd bought it in 2015 for $350,000, and both businesses paid rent that covered the mortgage while building my equity in what had become one of downtown Millbrook's most successful commercial addresses. The building was now worth at least $600,000, probably more given the recent development in the area. Total value approximately $1.4 million in real estate assets, plus nearly $180,000 in accumulated rental income sitting in accounts that only James Morrison and I knew existed. I pulled my laptop from the small table beside my cot, one of the few personal items I'd been allowed to keep in the garage, and logged into the secure client portal James had set up for me years ago. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. Monthly rent payments deposited automatically, property taxes and maintenance expenses handled by his office, insurance premiums current, tenant communications managed professionally. Victoria Blackwood might be sleeping in a garage, but V Enterprises, the business entity I'd created to hold my properties, was thriving. I composed an email to James, choosing my words carefully. James, I hope this finds you well. I need to schedule an urgent consultation regarding my property. I'm considering liquidating one asset and may need temporary residence at the Maple Lake Cottage while I make some significant life changes. Are you available to meet this week? This matter is time-sensitive and confidential. Best regards, Victoria. I sent the email at 6:47 a.m., knowing James was an early riser who often checked messages before his first client meetings. By 7:15 I had his response. Victoria, of course, can you meet at my office this afternoon at 2 p.m.? I've been wondering when you might activate these assets. Bring identification and any medical documentation you might have regarding your current living situation. We have options, James. Medical documentation regarding my current living situation. James was already thinking strategically, already understanding that this wasn't just a simple real estate transaction, but a rescue mission that might require legal justification. I spent the rest of the morning planning my approach with the same methodical attention to detail that had made Blackwood Interiors successful. This wasn't just about leaving the garage, or even leaving Marcus's control. This was about reclaiming my entire life, while protecting Sophia from the inevitable fallout. At 11 a.m., I heard Marcus's car leave for work. 20 minutes later, Sophia appeared at the garage door with a breakfast tray, toast, orange juice, and the antibiotics Dr. Martinez had prescribed. "How are you feeling, Mom?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine concern for the first time in weeks. "Much better," I replied honestly. "The fever broke and I can breathe more easily." Relief flickered across her face. "That's wonderful. Maybe the antibiotics are working faster than expected." I studied my daughter as she set the tray on my makeshift bedside table. Sophia looked tired, older than her 38 years, with stress lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before her marriage. Living with Marcus was aging her, though she probably didn't realize it yet. "Sophia, I need to ask you something important," I said carefully. "Are you happy?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I asked. In your marriage, in your life, in this house, are you genuinely happy?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw everything I needed to know. "Marcus takes good care of me, Mom. We have a beautiful home, financial security, a good social circle." "That's not what I asked." Sophia looked away, focusing on straightening items on the tray that didn't need straightening. "Happiness is complicated when you're an adult. It's not like when you're a child and happiness means getting ice cream or staying up late." "No," I agreed. "When you're an adult, happiness means being able to make your own choices, trust your own judgment, and feel respected by the people who claim to love you." She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Marcus says you're going to look at Golden Meadows this afternoon. He made an appointment for 3 o'clock. Of course Marcus was moving quickly now, probably sensing that my illness had given him the perfect opportunity to finalize my removal from their lives. He'd scheduled the nursing home visit for the same time as my meeting with James, betting that I'd be too weak, or too defeated to resist. "Sophia," I said gently, "what if I told you I had other options, that I wasn't as helpless as Marcus believes?" "What kind of options?" I took a breath, knowing that what I said next would begin the process of revealing everything I'd kept hidden for 15 years. What if I told you that your mother isn't the penniless old woman Marcus thinks she is? What if I told you I've been planning for exactly this kind of situation for longer than you've known him? Sophia's eyes widened. Mom, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that I've been underestimated by a man who thinks he's smarter than me, I replied, feeling strength return to my voice for the first time in months, and I'm talking about showing him exactly how wrong he's been. I reached for my laptop and turned the screen so Sophia could see the VB Enterprises account summary. Her mouth fell open as she scanned the property listings, the rental income reports, the asset valuations. Mom, where did all this come from? From 30 years of running a successful business and 15 years of careful planning, I said simply. Your father knew I was investing our profits, but he never knew the detail. I wanted to make sure that if anything ever happened, if I was ever in a situation where someone tried to control me or manipulate me, I'd have the resources to protect myself. Sophia stared at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. You own 3 properties. I own 3 properties worth over $1 million, I corrected, and one of them is a cottage where I can live comfortably while I decide what to do about this situation. This situation. I looked directly into my daughter's eyes, seeing Thomas's honesty reflected there beneath layers of Marcus's conditioning. The situation where my son-in-law has systematically driven me from my own home, destroyed my health with his cruelty, and is now trying to warehouse me in a nursing facility so he can have complete control over you and everything your father and I built. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications and unspoken truths. Finally, Sophia whispered, "What are you going to do?" I closed the laptop and smiled for the first time in months, not the careful diplomatic smile I'd been wearing to avoid conflict, but the confident smile of a woman who had just remembered her own power. I'm going to remind everyone exactly who Victoria Blackwood is starting this afternoon. James Morrison's law office was exactly as I remembered it, understated elegance that spoke of success without ostentation. The mahogany furniture was well maintained but not flashy, the artwork was original but not showy, and James himself looked like he'd barely aged in the 15 years since I'd first walked through his door. "Victoria," he said, rising from behind his desk with genuine warmth, "you look like hell." I actually laughed for the first time in months. "Thank you, James. It's refreshing to hear someone speak honestly about my current state." "Sit down and tell me everything," he said, gesturing to the comfortable leather chairs arranged around a small conference table, "and I mean everything. I've been handling your properties for 15 years and I've never seen you look this worn down." I told him everything. The systematic manipulation that had begun after Thomas's death, the gradual erosion of my place in my own home, the exile to the garage, and finally the pneumonia that Marcus was using as justification for forced institutionalization. James listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, his expression growing darker with each detail I shared. "Victoria," he said when I finished, "what you're describing isn't just family conflict, it's elder abuse, financial and psychological abuse that could have serious legal consequences for your son-in-law." "I'm not interested in prosecuting Marcus," I said quickly. "I want to protect Sophia and reclaim my independence, but I don't want to destroy my daughter's life in the process." James nodded thoughtfully. "Understood, but having documentation of abuse strengthens your position if Marcus tries to challenge your competency or interfere with your property rights. Men like him often escalate when they realize they're losing control." He pulled out a thick file folder labeled VB Enterprises and spread several documents across the table: property deeds, financial statements, rental agreements, maintenance records, all proof of the substantial assets I'd been quietly building for over a decade. "Let's talk strategy," James said. "The Maple Lake cottage is fully furnished and ready for immediate occupancy. I can have the utilities transferred to active status within hours, and the property management company can stock it with groceries today if needed. What about the other property?" "Both are performing excellently. The duplex tenants are long-term and reliable. Mrs. Chen has been in the upstairs unit for 6 years, and the Robertsons downstairs just renewed their lease for another 2 years. The commercial building is even better positioned. Riverstone Cafe wants to expand into the adjacent space when their lease comes up for renewal, and the Book Nook is interested in purchasing their unit outright. I felt a surge of pride at how well my investments had performed. While I'd been playing the role of helpless widow, my business acumen had been quietly building a foundation of security that Marcus could never touch. James, I need you to research something for me, I said. An idea for me. I want to know everything about Marcus Pemberton's financial situation, his business, his assets, his debts, everything. James raised an eyebrow. That's beyond my usual scope of practice, but I have contacts who specialize in financial investigations. What specifically are you looking for? I want to understand what Marcus really gets out of controlling Sophia and our house. His manipulation has been too systematic, too calculated to be just about social status or convenience. There's something else driving this. You think he has financial motivations beyond marrying into your family? I think Marcus identified a vulnerable woman with valuable assets and positioned himself to control those assets. The house alone is worth over $800,000, and Sophia has inheritance money from Thomas that she's never touched. But more than that, I want to know if Marcus is as financially secure as he pretends to be. James made another note. I'll have a preliminary report within 4. In the meantime, what's your immediate plan? I'm moving to the cottage tonight, I said decisively. No announcement. No dramatic confrontation. I'll simply be gone when they wake up tomorrow morning. Let Marcus try to explain to his parents why the woman he was planning to put in a nursing home disappeared overnight. And Sophia, that was the complicated question. I'd seen the shock in Sophia's eyes when I'd revealed my hidden assets, but I wasn't sure if that shock was enough to break through months of Marcus's psychological conditioning. I'm going to give her a choice, I said. Fine. I'll leave her a letter explaining where I've gone and why, along with an invitation to visit me when she's ready to have an honest conversation about her marriage. James nodded approvingly. Smart approach. No ultimatums, no pressure, just information and an open door. We spent the next hour reviewing practical details. James would coordinate with the property management company to prepare the cottage, arrange for grocery delivery, and ensure all utilities were active by evening. He'd also begin the discreet financial investigation of Marcus Pemberton, using contacts who specialized in background research for high-net-worth divorce cases. One more thing, James said as we concluded our meeting. I want you to document everything from this point forward. Keep a journal of all interactions with Marcus and Sophia, save any text messages or emails, and take photos of your current living conditions in the garage. If this situation escalates, we want a complete record. I left James's office, feeling more energized than I had in months. For the first time since Thomas's death, I had a clear plan and the resources to execute it. More importantly, I had allies, professionals who understood that what was happening to me wasn't normal family dynamics, but systematic abuse. My next stop was Millbrook Savings Bank, where I hadn't been in over a year. The safety deposit box I'd rented under V Enterprises contained additional documents James didn't keep in his office, original property deeds, insurance policies, and most importantly, a detailed financial plan Thomas and I had created for exactly this kind of emergency. Thomas had understood, even if he hadn't known the specific details of my investments, that our daughter might someday need protection from someone who didn't have her best interests at heart. We'd discussed hypothetical scenarios. What if Sophia married someone who was financially irresponsible? What if she was widowed young and vulnerable to predators? What if our own aging created opportunities for exploitation? In the safety deposit box was a letter Thomas had written shortly before his death, intended for Sophia but never delivered because I'd hoped it would never be necessary. The letter detailed his concerns about the kind of man who might try to isolate Sophia from her family, and his instructions for protecting the family assets he and I had worked decades to build. Reading Thomas's careful handwriting brought tears to my eyes, but also strengthened my resolve. He'd trusted me to protect our daughter when he couldn't, and I'd failed that trust by allowing Marcus to manipulate us both. But it wasn't too late to honor Thomas's faith in my judgment and strength. Back at the house, I used my key to enter through the back door while Marcus was still at work. Sophia was in the living room with Marcus's mother, Patricia Pemberton, a woman who had made her disapproval of me clear from the moment we'd met. Victoria, Patricia said with barely concealed distaste. Marcus told us about your health crisis. How unfortunate that you've waited so long to address your housing needs. The woman was sitting in my living room, in the chair Thomas had reupholstered as a surprise for my 60th birthday, commenting on my housing needs, as if I were a burden that had finally been properly managed. "Miss Pemberton," I replied pleasantly, "I'm feeling much better, thank you. In fact, I've just made some arrangements that will resolve all concerns about my accommodations." Sophia looked up sharply. "What kind of arrangements?" "Private arrangements," I said smoothly. "I'll be moving out tonight, so you won't need to worry about my health or comfort anymore." The relief that flickered across Patricia's face was quickly replaced by suspicion. "Moving where?" Marcus said. "You were looking at assisted living facility." "I have other options," I replied, enjoying the confusion in both women's expressions. "Options that will give everyone the space they need." I excused myself and went to the garage to pack my belongings. It didn't take long. Marcus had ensured I had very little to pack. But I did take Thomas's photograph from my nightstand, along with the few pieces of jewelry I'd kept hidden from Marcus's periodic suggestions about downsizing my possessions. As I folded my clothes into the suitcase I'd been living out of for months, I felt lighter with each item I packed. This wasn't defeat. This was liberation. I was choosing to leave on my own terms with my own resources to my own property. Marcus would come home tonight expecting to find a sick old woman resigned to institutional care. Instead, he'd find empty space and unanswered questions. The real test would be whether Sophia would have the courage to find me and learn the truth about what her marriage had cost both of us. The cottage on Maple Lake was everything I remembered and more. 15 years of professional property management had maintained it beautifully. The stone fireplace was clean and ready for use. The wraparound porch had been recently stained, and the interior felt fresh and welcoming despite having sat empty for months. As I settled into the master bedroom with its view of the lake through tall pine trees, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. Peace. James had been true to his word. The refrigerator was stocked with essentials, the heat was working perfectly, and fresh linens had been placed on the bed. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the porch as the sun set over the water, breathing deeply for the first time since my pneumonia diagnosis. My phone had been buzzing steadily since 7 o'clock. Missed calls from Sophia, text messages asking where I was. Increasingly frantic voicemails from Marcus demanding I return immediately. I'd turned off the notifications and let them accumulate. Tomorrow would be soon enough to deal with their panic. The letter I'd left for Sophia was straightforward and honest. "My dear daughter, by the time you read this, I'll be safely settled in my own home. Yes, I have my own home, as you'll learn if you choose to seek me out. I'm not missing or kidnapped or having a mental health crisis. I'm simply a woman who has remembered that she has options. For months I've allowed myself to be treated as a burden, an inconvenience, an elderly relative who needed management rather than respect. I've watched you transform from the confident, independent woman I raised into someone who seeks permission for her own thoughts and feelings. This isn't your fault, but it is a choice you'll need to make going forward. Marcus has underestimated me completely, and I suspect he's underestimated you as well. When you're ready to learn the truth about your marriage and your mother's situation, you know how to find me. All my love, Mom." I'd tucked the letter under her pillow, where she'd find it when she went to bed. Let Marcus wonder where I'd gone and how I'd managed to disappear so completely. At 9:15, my phone rang with James Morrison's number. I answered immediately. "Victoria, I hope you're settled comfortably," he said, "but I have preliminary information about Marcus Pemberton that you need to hear tonight." That was fast. "My investigator has contacts at several financial institutions, and Marcus Pemberton has been making himself visible in ways that raised red flags. Can you access email on your phone? I'm sending you a confidential I opened my laptop instead, logging into the secure client portal where James shared sensitive documents. The report was 23 pages long, but the executive summary told me everything I needed to know. Marcus Pemberton was broke, not struggling financially, completely insolvent. His real estate development business existed primarily on paper with a registered office address that turned out to be a mail forwarding service. The impressive portfolio of properties he'd mentioned to Sophia were either owned by his parents' trust or heavily mortgaged investment properties that were hemorrhaging money in the current market. More damaging was his debt situation. Marcus owed over $400,000 in business loans that were personally guaranteed, had defaulted on 2 commercial property mortgages in the past 18 months, and was being pursued by creditors for unpaid consulting fees dating back 3 years. The BMW he drove was leased through a business entity that was behind on payments. The expensive suits, the elaborate honeymoon, the costly renovations to our house, all of it had been financed through credit that was rapidly running out. But the most shocking revelation was buried on page 18 of the report. Marcus had attempted to take out a home equity loan against our house just 2 weeks after marrying Sophia. The application had been rejected because the lender discovered that while Sophia owned the property, she had no credit history or employment income that would qualify her for such a substantial loan. He'd tried to mortgage my house, the house Thomas and I had built debt-free, without even telling Sophia. My phone rang again, and this time it was Sophia's number. I answered, knowing she'd found my letter. "Mom, where are you?" Her voice was tight with stress and confusion. "Marcus is furious. He says you've had some kind of breakdown and we need to call the police to report you missing." "I'm not missing, Sophia. I'm in my own home on my own property, making my own decisions. And I'm perfectly sane." "Your own property?" "Mom, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the cottage I bought 15 years ago as part of a financial plan your father and I created to protect our family from exactly this kind of situation." Silence stretched across the phone line. Finally Sophia whispered, "Dad knew about this. Your father knew I was making investments. He didn't know the details because we agreed that some financial security should remain completely private, accessible only to me in case of emergency." "Marcus says," "Sophia," I interrupted gently, "before you tell me what Marcus says, I want you to think about something. When was the last time you made a decision, any decision, without first considering what Marcus would think about it?" Another long pause. "That's what married couples do, Mom. They consult each other." "Do they? Does Marcus consult you before making decisions? Did he consult you before trying to take out a $300,000 home equity loan against your house 2 weeks after your wedding?" I heard her sharp intake of breath. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about your husband attempting to mortgage the home you inherited from your father and me, without your knowledge, to cover business debts you've never been told about. That's impossible. Marcus would never." "Sophia, I have documentation, bank records, credit reports, loan applications, all obtained legally through my attorney. Your husband is not the successful businessman he's pretended to be. He's deep in debt and has been using your assets as collateral for his failing business venture." I heard her talking to someone in the background, Marcus's voice, urgent and commanding. When she came back on the line, her tone had changed, becoming defensive and distant. "Mom, Marcus says this is exactly the kind of paranoid thinking that Dr. Martinez warned us about. Elderly people with health problems sometimes develop conspiracy theories about their family members. Dr. Martinez had said no such thing, and we all knew it, but I recognized the tactic. Marcus was already reframing my revelations as symptoms of mental illness rather than accurate information about his deception. "Sophia, ask Marcus to show you the loan application he submitted to First National Bank on June 5th. Ask him to explain why the business address listed for Pemberton Development Group is a mail forwarding service. Ask him why 3 of his investment properties are in foreclosure proceedings." I'm not going to interrogate my husband based on accusations from someone who's clearly having a mental health crisis. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they sounded so completely unlike my daughter. This was Marcus speaking through Sophia, using her voice to deliver his defense. "All right," I said quietly. "When you're ready to hear the truth, you know where to find me. I love you, Sophia. That will never change, regardless of what choices you make." I hung up before she could respond, my hands trembling slightly from the confrontation. But beneath the hurt of hearing my daughter parrot Marcus's dismissals, I felt something else, certainty. I'd given Sophia information that would be impossible to ignore if she chose to verify it. Seeds of doubt that would grow every time Marcus made another financial excuse or avoided another direct question. An hour later, James called again. Victoria, my investigator just uncovered something else. Marcus Pemberton has been researching Pennsylvania's guardianship laws extensively over the past 2 months. He's been consulting with an attorney who specializes in obtaining legal guardianship over elderly relatives deemed mentally incompetent. My blood ran cold. He was planning to have me declared incompetent. It appears so. The timeline suggests he intended to use your illness and living situation as evidence of diminished capacity, then petition for emergency guardianship that would give him control over any assets you might have. But he doesn't know about my properties. He knows something, Victoria. The guardianship research began shortly after he hired a private investigator to look into your background. The investigator wasn't very good. He missed your business entity entirely, but he did find records of Blackwood interiors being more successful than Marcus had realized. I stared out at the dark lake, processing this information. Marcus hadn't just been trying to control Sophia and steal her inheritance. He'd been planning to have me declared legally incompetent, so he could access whatever assets I might be hiding. James, I want you to prepare a comprehensive legal response. If Marcus tries to pursue guardianship proceedings or claims I'm mentally incompetent, I want documentation ready that proves not only my competency, but his fraud and abuse. Already working on it, James assured me. By tomorrow we'll have a complete file that demonstrates your sound judgment, successful property management, and his systematic financial deception. After we hung up, I sat in the peaceful quiet of my cottage, feeling the magnitude of what I'd escaped. Marcus hadn't just been manipulating Sophia and making my life miserable. He'd been executing a comprehensive plan to take legal control of both of us and everything we owned. But he'd made one crucial error. He'd assumed that a 71-year-old woman living in a garage was helpless. Tomorrow I would begin showing him exactly how wrong he'd been about that. I woke up on my first morning at the cottage to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages, but also to something I hadn't felt in months: complete physical comfort. The bed was warm. The room was quiet, and I could breathe freely for the first time since moving to the garage. As I made coffee in my own kitchen, looking out at the morning mist over Maple Lake, I felt like Victoria Blackwood again instead of the diminished person Marcus had been trying to create. The text messages were increasingly frantic. Marcus demanding my immediate return, threatening to call Adult Protective Services, claiming I was having a mental breakdown that required intervention. Sophia's messages were fewer but more heartbreaking, pleading with me to come home, promising that we could work everything out, begging me not to abandon her. But it was the final message, sent at 6:47 a.m., that told me everything I needed to know about how desperate Marcus had become. Mother Blackwood, I'm driving to your location this morning to bring you home safely. Sophia is worried sick. Whatever misunderstanding has caused this episode, we can resolve it together as a family. He was coming here. Somehow he'd figured out where I was. I called James immediately. Victoria, are you secure at the cottage? He asked without preamble. For now, but Marcus says he's driving here this morning. How could he have found me? Several possibilities. GPS tracking on your phone, following your car, or simply checking property records once he realized you had resources he didn't know about. I felt a chill of vulnerability. James, I need you to meet me here before Marcus arrives. If he's planning some kind of intervention, or attempting to force me to return, I want witnesses. Already on my way. I'm bringing a colleague who specializes in elder law and a stenographer to document any threats or coercive behavior. We'll be there within 30 minutes. 25 minutes later, I watched James's car pull into my driveway, followed by a second vehicle. The sight of professional allies arriving to support me was almost overwhelming. For months, I'd felt increasingly isolated and helpless. Now I had a team. James introduced his colleague as Rebecca Chen, an attorney who had handled dozens of elder abuse cases, and knew exactly what to look for in Marcus's behavior. The stenographer, a quiet woman named Sarah, set up her equipment discreetly in the living room where it would capture any conversation that took place. Victoria, Rebecca said as we reviewed strategy, the most important thing is to stay calm and let Marcus reveal his true intention. Don't argue with his accusations, or try to prove your competency. Let him demonstrate his controlling behavior for our record. At 10:15, I saw Marcus's BMW navigating the winding road to the cottage. He wasn't alone. Sophia was in the passenger seat, and I could see the tension in her posture even from a distance. They parked behind James's car, and I watched Marcus take in the scene. The legal vehicles, the obviously upscale cottage, the clear evidence that this wasn't some homeless shelter or temporary refuge, but a well-maintained property. His expression shifted from confident authority to confused calculation. I opened the door before they could knock, greeting them on the porch where our conversation would be clearly visible to my legal team inside. "Marcus, Sophia," I said pleasantly. "What brings you all the way out here?" Marcus stepped forward, his charm in full display but with an edge I'd never seen before. "Mother Blackwood, we've been worried sick about you. This impulsive behavior isn't like you at all." "Impulsive?" I smiled. "I've owned this cottage for 15 years. Hardly an impulsive decision." Sophia's eyes widened as she took in the property. The professional landscaping, the recently stained deck, the obvious signs of ongoing maintenance and care. This wasn't a desperate refuge, but a beautiful home. "Mom," she said uncertainly, "you've owned this place for 15 years. Why didn't you ever tell us about it?" "Because I've learned the value of keeping some assets private," I replied, looking directly at Marcus, "especially when dealing with people who might view those assets as opportunities rather than security." Marcus's facade began to slip. "What exactly are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything, Marcus. I'm stating facts. Like the fact that you attempted to take out a home equity loan against Sophia's house without her knowledge, or the fact that your business exists primarily on paper while you're drowning in over $400,000 of personal debt." The color drained from Marcus's face, but he recovered quickly. "Those are private business matters that have nothing to do with your current mental state." "My mental state?" I laughed, feeling stronger with each exchange. "Marcus, I've successfully managed a business for 30 years, quietly acquired 3 valuable properties, and removed myself from an abusive living situation using my own resources and planning. If that's mental illness, I'd say it's highly functional." Sophia looked between us, confusion and dawning realization warring in her expression. "Mom, what 3 properties?" Before I could answer, Marcus stepped closer, his voice taking on the commanding tone I'd heard him use when he wanted to end conversations. "Sophia, your mother is clearly having some kind of breakdown. These fantasies about secret properties and business conspiracies are classic signs of paranoid delusions in elderly patients." "Fantasies?" I pulled out my phone and opened the VB Enterprises portfolio. "Sophia, would you like to see the documentation for my cottage here, the duplex in Millbrook's historic district, and the commercial building downtown that houses Riverstone Cafe?" Sophia took the phone with trembling hands, scrolling through property values, rental income statements, and maintenance records. Her face went white as she absorbed the information. "This says these properties are worth over $1 million, she whispered. "Closer to $1.4 million, actually," I confirmed. "Your father and I believed in diversified investments." Marcus tried to grab the phone from Sophia's hands. "These documents could easily be fabricated by someone experiencing cognitive decline." "Step back from my daughter," I said firmly, and something in my tone made Marcus freeze. "And stop touching her without permission." It was a small thing, but Sophia noticed it, the way Marcus had automatically tried to control what information she could access, the way he'd grabbed rather than asked. I saw her take a half step away from him. "Marcus," she said quietly, "why didn't you tell me about the loan application?" "What loan application?" "The home equity loan. For $300,000. Against my house." Marcus's eyes darted between Sophia and me, calculating his response. "That was a preliminary inquiry about available credit options. Nothing was finalized." "Available credit options on a house that belongs to me, for a business I know nothing about, to cover debts you've never mentioned." "Sophia, you don't understand business finance. I understand that my husband tried to mortgage my inheritance without telling me," Sophia interrupted, her voice growing stronger.
I understand that my mother has been living in a garage while you renovated rooms she built with my father, and I understand that you've been telling me she's mentally incompetent while she's been managing property worth more than most people see in a lifetime. Marcus realized he was losing control of the narrative. His charm disappeared entirely, replaced by cold calculation. Fine, he said harshly. Your mother has money. That doesn't change the fact that she's a bitter old woman who can't accept that you've moved on with your life. She's trying to manipulate you with these revelations. Trying to break up our marriage because she can't stand losing control over you. Control. Sophia's voice rose. Marcus, you've controlled every aspect of my life since we got married. What I wear, where I go, who I see, what I think about everything. When was the last time I made a decision without checking with you first? That's what marriage is. Marcus began. No, Sophia said firmly. That's not what marriage is. Marriage is partnership, not ownership.
I watched my daughter reclaim her voice, her strength, her sense of self, that Marcus had been systematically dismantling. Pride swelled in my chest as I recognized the woman I'd raised, emerging from beneath months of conditioning. Marcus turned to me, his mask completely off now. This is your doing, you poisonous old bitch. You've been planning this from the beginning. The only thing I've been planning, Marcus, is survival, I replied calmly. Everything else is just the natural consequence of your choices. He moved toward me aggressively, but James and Rebecca had emerged from the cottage at the first raised voice. Mr. Pemberton, James said firmly. I'm James Morrison, Mrs. Blackwood's attorney. This conversation is being recorded for legal purposes. I advise you to step back and lower your voice. Marcus looked around wildly at the attorneys, at the stenographer visible through the window, at Sophia who was staring at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. You can't prove anything, he said desperately. Even if she has money, even if I made mistakes, you can't prove I did anything illegal. Actually, Rebecca interjected, attempting to obtain loans using property you don't own without the owner's knowledge constitutes fraud. Researching guardianship procedures to gain control over someone's assets constitutes conspiracy. And your systematic isolation and abuse of Mrs. Blackwood constitutes elder abuse under Pennsylvania law. Marcus's face went gray. He turned to Sophia one last time, trying to summon his old persuasive power. Sophia, these people are turning you against me. Everything I've done has been for us, for our future together. Sophia looked at him with something close to pity. Our future? Marcus, you tried to steal my house. You put my mother in a garage and told me it was reasonable. You've spent months convincing me that my own thoughts and feelings were wrong. She paused, then said quietly, I want you to leave. Sophia, leave. Marcus, go back to the house, my house, and pack your things. I'll be staying here with my mother tonight while I figure out what happens next. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, realizing that his entire carefully constructed plan had collapsed in a single morning. Then, without another word, he walked back to his BMW and drove away, leaving us standing on the porch of my cottage in stunned silence. Sophia turned to me, tears streaming down her face. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. I wrapped my arms around my daughter, feeling her trembling against me. You have nothing to apologize for, sweetheart. You were manipulated by an expert. How did you know? She whispered. How did you see what I could? I smiled, thinking of Thomas, of all the years of building our life and business together, of all the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving and thriving through decades of challenges. Because I've been underestimated before, and I've learned that the most dangerous thing anyone can do is assume that an older woman has nothing left to fight for. 6 months later, I was sitting in my beautifully renovated kitchen on Rosewood Lane, watching Sophia arrange fresh flowers from the garden we'd replanted together. The roses Thomas had cultivated were blooming again. I'd managed to rescue and replant several from the landscaping company's dumpster, and the house felt alive in a way it hadn't since before Marcus had entered our lives. The legal proceedings had moved swiftly once Rebecca Chen filed the initial complaints. Marcus's attempt to defraud Sophia through the mortgage application provided clear evidence of criminal intent, and his research into guardianship procedures demonstrated premeditation. But perhaps most damaging was the financial investigation that revealed the full scope of his deception. Marcus Pemberton had been running what amounted to a marriage-based confidence scheme. The private investigator James hired discovered that Sophia wasn't his first target. There had been 2 previous relationships with recently widowed women of means, both of which had ended abruptly when his financial situation became untenable, or the women's families became suspicious. In the first case, he'd convinced a widow in Delaware to invest her late husband's insurance money in his development projects. When those projects proved to be fictional, she'd lost nearly $200,000 before her son intervened and threatened legal action. Marcus had disappeared overnight, leaving her emotionally devastated and financially compromised. The second case was even more disturbing. A widow in Maryland had actually married Marcus, only to discover that he'd been systematically draining her accounts and using her home as collateral for his debts. When she tried to leave, he'd had her committed for a 72-hour psychiatric evaluation, claiming she was suicidal and incompetent. It had taken her attorney weeks to get her released and begin the process of recovering her assets. "Mom," Sophia said, setting the vase of roses on the newly refinished dining room table, "I keep thinking about those other women, how scared they must have been, how alone they must have felt." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "But they survived, just like we did, and now Marcus can't hurt anyone else." The criminal charges had been extensive: fraud, attempted fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy, and identity theft. Marcus had actually been using fake credentials to present himself as a licensed real estate developer, when his actual professional background was in sales for a medical device company, a job he'd lost 3 years ago for falsifying client contracts. The civil lawsuit had been even more satisfying. Not only had we recovered all the money Marcus had spent on improvements to our house, but the court had ordered him to pay damages for emotional distress and the costs of my medical treatment for pneumonia. Since Marcus had no assets to speak of, the judgment would follow him for years, garnishing any wages he might earn in the future. But the most meaningful resolution had been the changes in our house itself. Together, Sophia and I had undone most of Marcus's renovations, restoring the spaces that held our family's history while making thoughtful updates that honored both the past and our future needs. The library was rebuilt with new custom shelving that displayed our books alongside family photographs and mementos from Thomas's life. The dining room was restored to its original warmth, with my grandmother's china back in its place of honor. Sophia's childhood bedroom became a guest room that actually felt welcoming rather than sterile, decorated with some of her childhood artwork that we'd rescued from the basement box. Most importantly, we'd converted part of the main floor into a private suite for me, not because I needed to be segregated from the household, but because we'd both learned the value of independence within family relationships. I had my own sitting room, bedroom, and kitchenette, connected to the main house but completely self-contained. It was everything Marcus's garage exile had not been: comfortable, dignified, and chosen rather than imposed. James called this morning. I told Sophia as we worked together preparing lunch. The book nook wants to expand into the additional space in my commercial building. The rent increase will boost my annual income by another 50. Sophia smiled, shaking her head in amaze. "I'm still getting used to having a real estate mogul for a mother." "Hardly a mogul," I laughed. "Just a woman who learned the importance of having options." The revelation of my hidden assets had initially shocked Sophia, but over the months of legal proceedings and house renovations, she'd come to understand the wisdom of my long-term planning. More importantly, she'd begun developing her own sense of financial independence. Using money from the civil judgment against Marcus, Sophia had enrolled in a business management program and was planning to restart her design career as an independent contractor rather than seeking employment with another firm. She'd also insisted on paying rent for living in the house despite my protests, because she wanted to contribute rather than simply inherit. I spent 2 years letting someone else make decisions about my money, my career, my life, she'd explained. I need to prove to myself that I can manage my own affairs. Dr. Martinez had been amazed by my physical recovery once I'd moved out of the garage. The pneumonia had cleared completely, my blood pressure had returned to normal levels, and I'd regained the 15 pounds I'd lost during those awful months of exile. More importantly, the stress-related symptoms that had been developing, the persistent headaches, the joint pain, the fatigue, had all disappeared once I was living in proper conditions with my dignity intact. Stress-induced illness is more common than people realize, Dr. Martinez had explained during my 6-month follow-up appointment. Your body was literally making you sick because your living situation was so unhealthy. The improvement in your health since removing yourself from that environment has been remarkable. Martha Hendricks had become a regular visitor, often joining us for coffee and celebrating what she called my complete transformation from victim to victor. She'd never liked Marcus, and took particular satisfaction in learning that her instincts about him had been absolutely correct. I knew that man was trouble the first time I met him, she said during one of our Tuesday morning coffee sessions in my renovated kitchen. Too smooth, too quick with the compliments, too eager to separate you from Sophia. Classic predator behavior. The ripple effects of our experience had extended beyond our immediate family. Rebecca Chen had asked if I'd be willing to speak with other elder abuse victims about recognizing manipulation tactics and developing financial safety nets. I'd agreed, and found it deeply meaningful to help other women understand that having options, financial, legal, and emotional, was the key to protecting themselves from predators like Marcus. Helen Rossman had connected me with a support group for women who had experienced family-based financial abuse, where I'd learned that Marcus's tactics were disturbingly common. The systematic isolation, the gradual erosion of decision-making authority, the reframing of independence as selfishness or mental instability. These were patterns that many women had experienced, often from their own adult children or the spouses of adult children. The key, I'd told one support group meeting, is understanding that you don't have to prove you're not helpless. You just have to refuse to be treated as if you are. As summer turned to fall, Sophia and I had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and completely new. We were mother and daughter again, but also two independent women who had learned to respect each other's autonomy while maintaining our connection. Sophia was dating again, carefully, slowly, with a much better understanding of what healthy relationships looked like. I was considering traveling, possibly even relocating to my cottage for part of each year to enjoy the peaceful lakeside lifestyle I'd discovered during my escape from Marcus's control. But most evenings, we still found ourselves in the kitchen together, cooking dinner and talking about our day. The difference was that now our conversations were between equals, two women who had survived a crisis and emerged stronger, wiser, and more appreciative of the family bonds that had ultimately proved unbreakable. Mom, Sophia said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner, I want you to know that I understand now why you kept those properties secret. Having resources that no one else knows about, it's not about not trusting family, it's about trusting yourself. I smiled, thinking of Thomas and the conversation we'd had years ago about the importance of contingency planning. He'd understood, even then, that true security came not from depending on others, but from knowing you could depend on yourself. Your father used to say that hope for the best but plan for the worst, I told Sophia. I'd never expected the worst to come from within our own family, but I'm grateful we were prepared. Outside, autumn was painting the maple trees in brilliant reds and golds, and I could see neighbors walking their dogs past the house where Thomas and I had built our life and where Sophia and I were now building our future. The garage where I'd spent those terrible months had been converted into a proper workshop space where Sophia was learning woodworking, wanting to understand the craftsmanship that had gone into our home. As I settled into my favorite chair in the evening, surrounded by books that were displayed with respect rather than hidden in basement boxes, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. Marcus had tried to reduce me to nothing more than an inconvenient old woman whose needs and dignity were negotiable. He'd underestimated not just my resources, but my resilience, my intelligence, and my absolute refusal to disappear quietly from my own life. Victoria Blackwood had emerged from that garage not as a victim, but as a woman who had remembered her own strength and used it to protect both herself and the daughter she loved. And that, I thought as I watched Sophia reading contentedly across the room, was a victory worth every difficult day that had led us here. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.